All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Mississippi River Network's webinar on the importance of healthy soil practices and current legislation. My name is Maisa Khan. I am the policy manager for the Mississippi River Network, and I am based out of St. Louis, Missouri. For friends joining us today who are unfamiliar with MRN, we're a coalition of 56 nonprofit organizations and businesses working together to protect the land, water, wildlife, and people of our greatest river, the Mississippi. The network implements a national public program for the river called One Mississippi that is designed to educate, engage, and inspire people to take action to protect the Mississippi River. Since 2009, the One Mississippi program has recruited 20,000 river citizens and inspired thousands of actions. MRN's work is made possible by funding from the McKnight and Walton Family Foundations, and we're so grateful that their support makes webinars like these possible. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two excellent presenters, Tim Wagner and Stephen Keleti. Before I introduce our presenters, just a few housekeeping items. One, as you can see, this webinar is taking place in Zoom with the normal Zoom meeting functionalities. So please take a minute to make sure you are muted right now, and please keep yourself muted at all times. Two, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. We will answer all of the questions at the end of both presentations, unless there's a question or two that really makes sense to quickly address in between Tim and Stephen's presentations. Feel free to type your question in the chat box at any time during the presentation. Three, this webinar is being recorded and presentation slides will be available in PDF format after the webinar. Our webinar will run for about an hour with each presenter speaking for about 20 minutes, followed by Q&A with the time that remains at the end. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, Tim Wagner and Stephen Keleti. Tim serves as the Agriculture Outreach Coordinator for the Isaac Walton League of America, working in both Iowa and Illinois. Tim's work focuses on outreach, education, and policies to improve conservation farming practices that build soil health, improve water quality, and protect habitat, all while benefiting our farmers and local communities. Tim lives in the driftless region of Northeast Iowa. Tim's presentation will be followed by Stephen Keleti's. Stephen is an advocate for state healthy soils legislation, writing initial draft legislation, helping bring together groups, and working with groups to draft and move legislation forward in numerous states. Stephen is based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim. Tim Wagner, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Maisa. Am I coming through okay? Everybody hear me all right? Good. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining in. This is exciting, and I want to make this very clear that the information that I am presenting today is not intended to point blame at farmers. It is more so to help the public understand the link between modern industrial agriculture and water quality and the ways that we can improve that and help farmers become more profitable, while at the same time improving our lakes and rivers and so forth. And since this is tied in with the MRN group, I think it's a pretty appropriate topic for people to take an interest in. So while there are many non-ag sources of pollutants and contaminants throughout the upper Mississippi River watershed, agriculture remains a dominant land use within the Mississippi River, within the watershed. With that said, agricultural practices related to our impaired waters are tied to largely a lack of awareness and information and cultural norms, i.e. this is how my dad taught me, this is the way I'm going to do it. and that it is not the product of farmers not caring for the resource. Rather, we are literally witnessing a revolution today in farm practices, literally from the ground up, as more and more farmers are obtaining access to new and better information on how to better take care of their soil and land while also improving their bottom line during these very uncertain times. So whether you're a farmer or not, becoming aware of this revolution that we call regenerative agriculture and helping to spread the word is a huge step forward. So thanks for being engaged. Next slide. So let's see, Kelly, can we, there we go. Awesome. So it's really important to know where we've been in order to better determine where we need to go. Next slide. Next slide, Kelly. Do we have it there?
I'm sorry, it's showing the next slide on my screen. So here is our first technical difficulties, and I'm not sure. What do you see on your screen? Do you see homesteading?
Yeah.
Okay, and you want the next slide?
No, that one is fine. We just need to get to the actual slide presentation. Right now you have it. It's showing up with all the additional slides and the notes at the bottom. There we go. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Kelly.
All right, sorry.
So, no, that's okay. No, this is, these things happen, so it's no big deal. So in 1819, one could purchase Illinois farmland from the federal government for about $1.25 an acre. But the sticky nature of the soil didn't work well for conventional plows made back in the East. And in 1837, an Illinois blacksmith shop owner named John Deere perfected the self-polishing steel plow, allowing the ground to be tilled much easier and faster. So as America expanded westward, Congress enacted 8 variations of the Homestead Act from 1850 to 1934 that eventually saw more than 1.6 million homesteads established on 270 million acres, a total of 10% of all the land in the US. Next slide.
Is it still showing the same? Okay,
Nope.
I think there's just a delay between the slides.
Okay, you're good to go there. Great, thank you. So the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s was a combination of millions of acres of former grassland now tilled for cropland uses, combined with more than 4 years of intense record-setting drought, which affected approximately 100 million acres, mostly in grasslands, states west of the 100th meridian. Estimates are that many areas of the Farm Belt lost 75% of its topsoil. It also affected much of America to the east as huge dust storms we called black blizzards were felt as far away as New York City and Washington, D.C. It had a profound impact on farming all over the country because we finally began to realize for the first time that soil needs plants and root systems in order to stay anchored in place. Eventually, the US government mobilized under the direction of FDR with the establishment of the Soil Erosion Service in 1933, which was later reorganized under the Department of Agriculture and renamed the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. Next slide. There we go, perfect. So as Ag Secretary Earl Butz from the 1970s was noted for favoring large corporate farm operations with large-scale production of commodity crops such as corn and soybeans. And he was often quoted as saying, get big or get out. He abolished FDR's programs as part of the New Deal, including the conservation programs that paid farmers to idle land, the program now known as the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Next slide. Great. So there is a cultural norm out there, and I can speak to this because I grew up with this, where the desire is to see fine black soil. We have this notion in our head that that's the only way a field looks pretty, is if you see this great expanse of nice black loamy dirt. And obviously that was, we've come to find out that that really wasn't necessarily so. But old habits often die hard. Next slide, please. There we go. So habitat really exists both above, word is getting out there that tillage at nearly all levels destroys the microbial habitat of the soil that is necessary for the soil to feed the plants, process and store carbon, and store water. Once that fragile ecosystem is broken, soil particles are free to roam. Next slide, please. There we go. It's just going to do this the whole way through, isn't it? Oh, well, we'll get by. So successful plant growth and diversity above ground come with a healthy ecosystem below the ground. That has been established, and actually that was established before we even broke the prairie. Next slide. And you can probably hit the next one here too, Kelly, but we embarked on a new business model, one that put a much greater emphasis on bushels per acre rather than profits or the quality of food. As you can see, this graph from about 1940 begins to go up in terms of measuring yields of corn. And it's been on that trajectory now for the better part of 70 years. And now we're beginning to understand that maybe we need to look at it a little bit differently, which I'll get into. Next slide. There we go. So you can see this is an image from the NRCS. That new business model obviously put such a strong emphasis on commodity crops like corn. Over the last 60 years, we transitioned away from family farms that raise multiple crops, including livestock raised on the land. Today, we have large expanses devoted to vast monocultures of corn, soybeans, and wheat, with little in the way of crop diversity. And the overwhelming majority of livestock is grown in confined operations. So you can see, you can hit the next slide, Kelly, but just as it's transitioning, I'll point out, you can see that dark green really does show the high intensity of corn grown throughout Iowa and the upper Mississippi River connection, or the upper Mississippi River watershed, excuse me. Saw the word connection pop up. Should pop up here. There we go. This is a similar map that shows soybean production throughout the upper Midwest. Next slide. So literally in a span of decades, we converted some of the most fertile, nutrient-rich, resilient soils, those capable of growing healthy plants with minimum synthetic inputs, to basically dirt with degraded levels of organic matter and little water storage capacity. We also at the same time created a market for high uses of fertilizers and chemicals. And it hasn't always worked to the farmer's advantage. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about runoff, we're talking about a lot of things running off. And a lot of that is soil. We're losing a lot of soil. We're still on the average throughout upper Midwest and many states like Iowa and Minnesota losing roughly, you can hit the next slide, Kelly. For some reason it went back. There we go. We're still losing by most estimates around 5 to 5.5 tons of topsoil per acre per year. You can leave that right there. That's fine, because I was going to go to that anyway. So degraded soil structure with little water storage capacity and thereby forcing more runoff, which comes from increased capacity of tile lines, often placed 20 yards or less apart to capture and direct the water that would normally remain in the soil column. Combined with increased rainfall and major downpour events, all of this is like a train wreck. It's basically a recipe for more downstream flooding, which is what really is happening. We're taking all that water that used to just years ago when it was still prairie would stay largely in the water column or in the soil column and stay there for plant usage as we go into drier periods. But now we're pushing so much of that water off the farm and it's going downstream. Next slide. Here we go. So climate change demands that we implement practices that make our landscapes more resilient. 2019 was the 12th wettest year on record for Iowa. It came on top of already saturated soils. So these images were pretty common a year ago. We saw this very extensive flooding as well in the Missouri River on the west side of Iowa and throughout many of the rivers throughout the upper Midwest. These areas were hit some of the hardest. Next slide, please. There we go. So this image at the top of this slide, most people have seen this in some form or another. This is just a GIS graphic of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf, which, last year and several years running now, it has approached about the size of New Jersey, roughly about 8,700 square miles, where basically it's biologically dead. And why is that? Well, we're putting a lot of stuff down into the Gulf. Along with that topsoil, we're putting a lot of nitrates. This bottom image shows Iowa's contribution to the hypoxic zone just in nitrates alone. The green line shows the overall contribution from 2003 up to 2019, where we've actually seen an increase of 100%. And then the blue line represents that which goes into the Mississippi River, and the brown line indicates what goes into the Missouri River. And of course, those combine at St. Louis, which all heads down to the Gulf. And then you throw in all the other states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, you can start to see the extent of the problem. Next slide. There we go. So Ray Archuleta is a guy that often considered the soil guy. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him, where he talks specifically in this, he talks about the water infiltration problem. Most people think it just runs off and we have this runoff problem. No, it really stems from the fact that water is not going down where it belongs. Next slide. But it's really important to understand that water infiltration in soil is a really good indicator of soil health. This slide comes from Gabe Brown, considered by many to be kind of the godfather of regenerative agriculture. This indicates a test plot he put on his farm starting in 1991. It was traditionally farmed, and over the years, Gabe has implemented many regenerative practices, which we'll get into here in a little bit. And he's increased the water storage capacity and infiltration rate of a soil by 60-fold over that time period. That is water that's going down into the soil column and not taking soil with it versus running off and flooding most people downstream. You can leave that right there. That's perfectly fine. So it's really important when you talk about regenerative agriculture and the various practices, it goes back to the health of soil before we actually broke the prairie and understanding that relationship between hooves and soil. And so much of farming practice up until the last 25 years or so, where a lot of livestock was basically run on pasture ground, we mimicked that same relationship in many ways. But when we began in the early 90s to shift livestock production into large animal, confined animal feeding operations, we lost that portion of what the soil needs. And it has had tremendous impacts in many ways on our soil health and our water quality. Next slide. Here we go. Excuse me. So Iowa happens to be one of the states, actually is a state that leads the nation in hog production. We currently have about 24 million hogs, combined with the cattle and chickens and turkeys and so forth. The calculations are, when you look at the amount of waste being generated by that much livestock, you would have to have, the population of Iowa would have to be roughly about the size of Bangladesh to equal that amount of waste going onto the ground. And that's waste that's being either spread or knifed into the ground every year. And quite honestly, most soil biologists will tell you that the excess amount of nutrients coming from all that extra manure is overloading the soil in its capacity to process those nutrients, and what it can't process, it eventually just winds up going through the tile line or out running off and into the creeks and down the river. Next slide, please. So soil health and regenerative agriculture principles are pretty much common throughout this movement that is going on. There's lots of variations and types of cover crops and so forth, but these basic principles of increasing the amount of number of crops you're growing, getting away from, trying to get away from monocultures, minimizing or reducing tillage to the very least that you possibly can, keep plants growing throughout the year, keep soil covered as much as possible, and integrate livestock into your system if possible. These 5 combined really are having a dramatic impact on the health of our soils. I can tell you that most farmers that we see that are getting into these practices, they usually go down the road of using cover crops and no-till first, and then begin to experiment with other methods. But those 2 are the most common using cover crops and getting away from tillage. And you can have tremendous impacts in nutrient loss and growing your soil organic matter by just doing those 2 practices alone. So it's really encouraging to see what's going on out there. Next slide, please. So it's really important to understand, this is a major point here. Soil is dirt. Excuse me, soil is not dirt. It's certainly a myth that many of us grew up with, as kids, and I certainly grew up with it on the farm. But considering how many microbes are in a tablespoon of healthy soil, and then what those microbes actually do is very important to understanding the relationship between healthy soil, good food, quality food, and water quality. Next slide, please. And the benefits that come from the regenerative revolution are just astounding. And I put an emphasis again on this 1% increase in soil organic matter can result in roughly 16,000 to 27,000 gallons of water additionally being stored per acre. So when you take that times millions and millions of acres and throw that in the context of those images of flooding downstream on the Mississippi or the Missouri River, you can start to understand the benefits of increasing soil organic matter and what that means for flooding. This is really a big deal, and more farmers are beginning to understand this. It's a tremendous trend. Next slide, please. This slide is something we've all seen many variations of this, but it's just basically the carbon cycle. And it goes without saying that good, healthy soil stores carbon. Current farming practices like in Iowa, for example, with industrial type agriculture with a lot of tillage and conventional monocultures, it's been estimated we're still losing about 1,000 pounds of CO2 per acre per year from the state of Iowa. Every time they take that plow, that tillage instrument across the soil, they're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And that carbon is critical to plant growth and those microbes that need it in order to feed and process and provide nutrients for the plants. So yeah, I don't need to say any more about this. Next slide, please. And this is really an important point here. It's really, I think it's critical to understanding what we have done to our quality of food over the years because we have not taken very good care of the soil. You can see in this slide the decline in minerals just in vegetables alone from industrial agriculture over the last 40 to 50 years. I had a farmer tell me not too long ago that an orange grown today has about 1/10 of the nutrients in it that we had from an orange grown in the 1960s, simply because the soil is so degraded. You can grow anything as long as you pump enough water into it along with chemical inputs. But is it good food you're going to grow? Maybe not. And that's the real key point here. Next slide. This is the same thing for the meat that we consume, because that livestock, that beef and that pork, they are being fed. It depends on what they are being fed. If they're being fed steady diets of highly processed grain versus out there grazing on pasture ground, it's going to have a lot less mineral content within that dose of meat that you have, that nice steak that you have for dinner tonight. So these things really contribute to the overall health of Americans, as we are seeing in many, many ways. Next slide. This is just a point that really is, I think, drives all this home. Good, healthy soil equals clean water equals good food, and goes right back and circles right back around. And eventually, next slide, it comes right back to us. Healthier soil makes healthier people. And here's the last slide. And these are things that you can do. Here we go. Lots of things that people can do. So hopefully we'll have some good questions, and I'll end it right there and let you take it over from here, Maisa.
Thank you so much, Tim. And Kelly, you can keep it on that page. I just have one question from Tasha that I think, Tim, you talked about tilling and no-till. The question is, what is the difference between tilling and cultivating?
That's a very good question. Cultivating, the way it was that when I grew up on a farm, we actually went out and cultivated the ground between the rows of corn or soybeans that were already coming up. So we had a cultivator that literally went right between the rows, and it would remove the grass and the weeds that were starting to grow between the rows of corn and beans. Tillage, on the other hand, is a process where they're actually preparing the soil to come back in and plant it. It's a big difference. Great. Very few people actually cultivate anymore, simply because now they're controlling so much of the weed with chemicals.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tasha, for that question. And thank you again, Tim, for that excellent presentation. We will send out Tim's presentation after the webinar. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box and we will have Q&A at the very end. So with that, I will turn it over to our second presenter, Stephen Keleti. Stephen, take it away.
Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us on this call and this webinar. My name's Stephen Keleti. I came to doing soil health policy about 3 years ago. I was a delegate to a climate congress in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I connected with a few folks who were doing soil health work, and I naively asked the question whether anyone was doing any legislation and that they knew of, and they said no. And since I had done some what's called citizen-initiated legislation in Massachusetts, I said I'd give it a shot. And one thing led to another, and I started helping not only with the legislation in Massachusetts, but with Connecticut and writing legislation drafts for Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, and Kansas, and Colorado, working across the country and helping folks come together and write legislation. So I helped with the Soil for Climate. They helped me, and we created this Healthy Soils Legislation Google group where you can contact me if you'd like to be part of the Google group and get updates. And we subsequently, with Kyle Rose Ostrander and others, took the information and added extra information and created healthysoilspolicy.org, which has a lot of the information on what's going on in individual states on the website, and any gaps or updates, welcome to get those forwarded to me or to the state at healthysoilspolicy.org to update that information. So let me move this over. What we do with Healthy Soils legislation policies, primarily it's been farmer-led. A lot of environmental groups have been working in another area, but it really seemed clear that Healthy Soils legislation needed to be led by farmers. So in each state, we primarily have contacted folks involved with the soil and water conservation districts, with state organic farming groups, with other farming groups, and food policy groups, essentially based on like what Tim was saying, that there's so much impacts on health and nutrition that there are various food policy groups that are very interested in healthy soils legislation. And the legislation that's been brought about has been very bipartisan and nonpartisan. Bills have been submitted by farmer legislators of both parties, and it's been remarkable how legislation is passed unanimously in different state houses, and that really no opposition that is significant to speak of. It's really been one of these areas that there's broad bipartisan support. So most of the time when we do healthy soils policy, we start off with why, and that helps get out of any of the problems of any feeling of blame or what's been done in the past. It's just lead with why. As Tim said, increasing the soil organic matter holds water 20,000 gallons per acre for every 1% increase in soil organic matter. It reduces runoff and protects water quality. It requires less fertilizer. The fungi and bacteria are able to supply nutrients to the plants. That's one thing that Tim was talking about, was that it's just not what's in the soil. It's the fact that the fungi and the bacteria have this relationship with the root system. The root systems put sugars out to feed the fungi and bacteria, and in return, the fungi and bacteria bring in nutrients into the root structure. When that symbiosis is broken by fertilizers, they just get the nutrients and not of the nitrogen, but not the other nutrients, because that fungal root system has been changed. So we also talk about not just the nutrients, but also how soil loss is important. As Tim mentioned, we have lost half to 2/3 of our soil, and this is a time to rebuild that soil as well as the health of it. And a big significant talking point has been the increased profitability. A lot more studies have been done in the last few years to show how much more profitable farms are, essentially because of the large reduction in input costs, so that we are seeing $100 per acre increased profitability for farmers. So the big thing is really using legislation as a tool for education. It's been really shown to be an effective tool. Once we have a very simple bill to legislators, the legislation staff understand the importance, and they help find ways to increase funding for soil health and other factors. For example, in Illinois, the bill passed unanimously in both chambers last session, and they also received $300,000 for cover crops, and that was not even asked for. Legislators and others really want to do the right thing, and this is a way of making them aware of what to do. Healthy soils legislation was on the docket or under consideration in all the northern Mississippi River states in 2019 and 2020. Again, just on this slide, just reminding people to join the Google group or visit the Healthy Soils website. So the idea that is working in a lot of states is having sort of a framework of policy, starting, as I mentioned, with education. And so not only the education of the legislators, but educating legislators on the importance of training and funding for training. Some of the bills really look at helping fund farmer-to-farmer training. There's a lot more trust and effectiveness in farmers working with other farmers to help understand what practices work best for them. You have to meet things where they're at with the soil conditions on a particular farm or a particular field. And it's important to have that sort of sensitivity and understanding of the process of improving the soil health. Then there's also the creation of healthy soil action plans. So there's a framework within each state to help fill in the gaps of what things are getting funding, what things need funding, and what can be improved. The NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, now is having internally, and hopefully in some states with others, developing soil health strategies. And that's one step towards having a healthy soil action plan that it works with the state government and other state programs and state organizations and non-government organizations. And what also helps is the establishment and increased funding for pilot programs, supporting farmers that have experience in providing demonstration opportunities with other farmers and ranchers, and also to collect the cost benefit data, because that helps legislators. If you have how much it costs for the increased inputs or changes, and then you see the benefits in terms of increased profitability and other benefits to the public in terms of flood mitigation, et cetera, that helps legislators and others find funding, because then they can justify that additional expense. So I'm going to go through quickly some examples of what has been going on in different states. There's a whole different package of different kinds of legislation. Many in parallel could work in various states throughout the Mississippi River corridor. Initially in 2019, there's healthy soils laws in 6 states: Oklahoma, Vermont, and Utah. Those were based on ideas of carbon sequestration, when there was talk in the early part of the millennia of having a tax and fee and dividend kind of approach. California in 2016 created a carbon fee, and that's been funding like $7.5 million a year towards healthy soils programs. Maryland in 2017 created a program without funding, so it kind of came off to a slow start, and now they're getting more funding for different things this year. Hawaii was a surprise, very small amount of money to do study work. And this last year, from that study 2 years ago, a whole range of bills were submitted in order to help soil health. In 2019, things have ramped up dramatically. There were bills filed in 10 states and passed in 4. The bill I mentioned in Illinois just simply added soil health to the conservation law. Nebraska, they created a task force to create a healthy soils program. In Vermont, they'd had some incentives for environmental stewardship, healthy soils things based on the 2008 law, and they put it into law last year. And they also had a working group to do ecosystem services. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that's becoming a bigger part of legislation. In New Mexico, they passed a Healthy Soils Act with a program and funding in last year. And this year, thus far, it's really even ballooned even more. We've had bills in 16 states and passed already in 2. In Washington, the Sustainable Farms and Fields, working with farmers on sustainable ag and working on that, and funding for working with the University of Washington on soil health programs and helping support farmers. In Maryland, as I mentioned, they had expansion of their cost share program that helped with increased funding for soil health. So just to go through the pictures of this current state map, which was the background of the other images, we can see in green the states that have things passed. In teal, there's passed and pending. California has another bill this session. Utah had some progress this session on actually setting aside a huge support under water quality initiatives, as well as that was part of the discussion in helping the momentum in Iowa and Illinois. So then there's pending. You can see the blue states, that's states where bills have either been drafted or on the docket, but may have not passed or are currently in the session. And various other states are in stages of interest, activity, and drafted. A lot of these states you can see just as in the salmon color of being interested. We know people are interested all over the country in every state. It's just really, this map is somewhat incorrect because we just haven't connected with the people who want to work on legislation. So here's a quick thumbnail of what's been going on in the Mississippi River states. Minnesota, which has had a lot of very good programs at the regulation level, had 4 bills that all these have pretty much stalled because of the pandemic shutting down legislatures. But they had one for supporting soil health for drinking water quality protection. They had a bill to create an action plan in Minnesota. They had an interesting bill. They wanted to make sure that when there was solar fields created, that the soil health was part of the management plan in terms to make sure that the soil remained healthy with high infiltration rates to make sure there was flood mitigation and that the soil could be returned to farming once the solar panel field was decommissioned. And they were having a bill for farmer-to-farmer education. In Wisconsin, again, a technical assistance bill, farmer-to-farmer training, helping farmers create healthy soil plans for their farms and ranches. And they had a $5 per acre cover crop insurance rebate. Sort of it was inspired by what was done in Iowa, so that, you know, because there's lower crop risk, you should reward the farmers when they do soil health practices. And so again, there's several other bills, but those have all stalled. But I think we're going to move forward with those next session. So as I mentioned, ecosystem services, there's been a lot of talk about carbon and carbon sequestration and the interest in soil health because of the possibility and of drawing down a lot of carbon with agricultural practices. Yet there's a lot more benefit than just, you know, carbon drawdown. The main leading points that have been moving the conversation forward have been the drought resilience, the stormwater management, and the water quality. when you take any one of those items, you can justify the extra expense to do soil health practices. So it's just a total overwhelming win to do soil health practices, increase funding and support. Just adding a little element of that's from another angle, it's parallels other things. If and when people want to work on soil health legislation or policy, they can feel free to reach out to me and I can send them other information. This is just one example of another avenue in parallel with legislative work, this sort of in the policy world, is the fiduciary responsibility issue. Loss of soil and loss of soil health is a loss of land asset value. So it's important that to realize that if that 40% of our agricultural land is leased, and if that it is the fiduciary responsibility of the land manager to protect, if not enhance, the value of the land assets under their management. And that's not been well recognized. Essentially, there's been studies that show that there's essentially been a loss of 1.25 pounds of soil for every pound of food created. So essentially, conventional agriculture is effectively chemically mining the soil. So if you lose your soil, you've lost your ability to produce crops and you've lost the value of the land. So it's really important once land managers understand that and then understand that they are protecting their asset values and it's the responsibilities to do so, we'll see, I believe, a very dramatic increase in the implementation of soil health practices in the next few years. So what I tell people in working is to remain positive and assume agreement. There's been a lot of frustration in a lot of other areas of policy, yet there's pretty common agreement on support for soil health. So typically, legislation hasn't moved forward in various states because of essentially doubt and delay. People don't think it's possible, so they don't try, or they don't put things forward early enough. A lot of groups, farm groups and other groups, set their policies for the next session pretty closely after the last session ends or towards the fall, because a lot of them are doing harvest and other activities which prohibit them from taking much time to work on policy. So they typically have been vetting and working on prioritizing policy through the summer and into the fall. So it's always a good time to start doing work on legislation because it's a process. It's important to have policy resolutions put forward to different farmers union and farm bureau on soil health so that helps support those groups putting energy towards passing legislation in the state. It's important, again, to start with the farmers and farm groups, and it's important to take the insights from all the stakeholders and try to work towards a bill that uses those insights and addresses the gaps that they see that would help them move forward. It's important to do language that emphasizes the common ground. We've found that healthy soils is rather more useful than using the word regenerative agriculture because, for example, regenerative agriculture to organic farmers means beyond organic farming. And people who are conventional farmers are thinking that sometimes they're thinking if you're saying regenerative agriculture, you're trying to get them to become organic, and that's not the case. It's also due to the soil-water connection. Bills are including also watershed health because that ecosystem of the water is integral to the health of the soil. So again, thank you. And if you want to get a hold of me, the information is here.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I will start by apologizing for mispronouncing your last name. It's Keleti?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Stephen Keleti. Thank you so much, Stephen. So we have 3 questions, 3 direct questions and 1 kind of open-ended thought. So I'll start with the questions first. So first question from Chris. Do current soil health practices make us more vulnerable to the consequences of severe drought as it does for the consequences of flooding? So Tim or Stephen, thoughts on impacts of healthy soil on drought in addition to flooding?
Actually, healthy soil, and that's a great question. Healthy soil has much greater water storage capacity than degraded soils. So as a result, it would make the soil column much more resilient for needed moisture for the plant growth if we go into dry periods. Many stories abound about farmers who have experienced this very same thing. And so, yeah, that's one of the main reasons for increasing soil organic matter, increasing soil water infiltration rates, because that column will store, like I showed in that one slide, will store a lot of water. And we get into July and August, dry periods, that becomes very valuable to the plant.
Yeah, I want to echo that, and that it's also, that's the primary reason we were able to get the Massachusetts legislation and other legislation so far. Is a couple of years before we submitted the legislation in Massachusetts, we had a terrible drought in Massachusetts, and it was a real sensitive issue for legislators because of the farm losses in the state. And so that helped us really get their interest in the bill, was because of the water retention. And in New Mexico, that was a really big point, because they have various areas that essentially can almost add 50% to your effective water for the year, because you were able to keep it on in the ground rather than it getting burned off.
Great, thank you. Next question, I'm gonna go through the direct questions first, and then we'll come back to the open-ended ones. So next question, Tasha asks, is there any legislation or policy around soil in urban areas and the contaminants that can be found there?
Yes. The original Massachusetts bill, for example, was just focused on agricultural land. Yet in the next session, they opened it wide open to include forest lands, wetlands, urban areas across the board, so that the programs would support all types of soils. And so they don't get into the contamination issues directly. Yet they sort of do indirectly, because there's inclusion in the definitions of the programs, a reduction or optimization of chemical inputs.
Thank you. From George, is the soil health discussion at the federal and state levels, along with the big commodity business, simply a way to further promote agricultural intensification, industrial commodity, and meat production?
That's a big fear. Yeah, it's a legitimate fear, is the greenwashing of a lot of efforts. That there's a fear that many of these programs could be subverted towards that end, and so that's something that everyone has to stay vigilant on in terms of messaging and in terms of the priorities of how these programs are implemented. I think that making sure that we have good metrics on soil health and ecosystem services, I think the more likely we are to be able to redirect the conversation away from that problem.
Yeah, I agree. To be clear and to be fair, there are some opportunities within the retail sector as this transition continues to evolve, particularly in the equipment manufacturing sector, where new types of planters are being developed every year that either use strip till or no-till. Roller crimpers that farmers use to come back and basically eliminate or kill the cereal ryegrass as a cover crop before they plant the corn or soybeans through it, versus using chemicals. Those kinds of things are happening out there, and so there's some opportunities out there. But Stephen is right. We're already seeing signs where some are going to try to capture the narrative around soil health and regenerative agriculture and use it as a way to market some new chemical or whatever, and we have to be aware of that for sure.
Yeah, there's fears of, like, there's the inoculants that people are doing, and I have a personal fear that a lot of these biological solutions could potentially become microbiological invasive species, that could cause regional havoc. So we do have to be careful. And good news is a lot of the bigger food processing companies are wanting to have regenerative agriculture be their source in their supply chain. And that's, I think, is going to really shift the conversation. The more we're able to get the major food, we call it system people, to do support for these programs.
Great. So we have 5 minutes remaining, 3 questions and 1 open-ended thought. So I'm going to do rapid fire the 3 questions, which I think are all related to legislation. So Stephen, a little bit more about how you reach out to ag groups. Who are your allies? Why do you think you have been successful with bipartisan support? And does any legislation include language for urban areas related to runoff and reducing runoff? So how you reach out to ag groups, who are your allies? Why do you think you've been successful, bipartisan support, and legislation about runoff?
Boy, that's a lot. Sometimes I'm surprised why I'm successful. Really, it's really kind of a gift from God. I just don't know why. It's the right people seem to want to do something at the right time, and sometimes it takes a year or two of drip to the different people who are active in the area, and all of a sudden something happens and everybody decides to do something. I think the point is I start with kind of like how Ben Franklin used to talk about how you would raise funds. You start with the people who are your friends, and then the people who maybe would have supported you but didn't want to be the first one in the room, they'll join the rest. So we start with the people who are willing. In most of the states, it's been a core group of 3 or 4 people. It's not, people think they have to get a lot of people to do legislation, but it really turns out that a small core group is what actually is most effective in getting something done. And the bipartisan part is that it's like, once you have a bill and you explain it to legislators of whatever party, it's like the partisan whatever doesn't even seem to enter into the picture, except worrying about someone feeling left out. They want to make sure that you haven't upset somebody by not including them. So you just start with your friends.
Great, thank you. Well, the final thought is from Laura. We're hearing out of Wuhan, China, that land and water there, also a great river confluence, is highest saturated with Roundup and glyphosate. The lack of biodiversity, water, and soil is linked to endangered human health, including the COVID virus. It is essential to the case for protecting the natural habitat along our river corridor to quantify this case. I would appreciate any insights from speakers on this. So the idea of, places where there are increased contaminants in our soil contributing to decreasing health outcomes, and how, as we're grappling with this pandemic, how all of these systems are connected. Thoughts?
I can address that quickly. I didn't really answer that one question about the urban part. That's sort of not a state level thing that we've been dealing with effectively, as working with individual municipalities to do organic management plans and that kind of thing towards helping urban soil health. And so that's that part. And then the other part was because you need fewer inputs with healthy soils. I think that the more we're able to, show those test cases to folks about that, I think we're going to see a major shift in other countries as well on support for soil health.
Yeah, I would just add real quickly that, you mentioned the issue with glyphosate and contaminates in the rivers and stuff. I mean, glyphosate is a huge problem, and it's worldwide. And there is very little of our food that we get from the conventional supermarket today that probably doesn't have some traces of glyphosate in it. And it's been shown that glyphosate actually will destroy some of that critical bacteria in your gut. And that critical bacteria in your gut is also part of a healthy ecosystem within your own body, fight off infectious diseases. And so it really begins to mess with so much of our biological factors within our own body that we make ourselves susceptible to those kind of infectious diseases and viruses and so forth. So it's all very much related. All the more reason for people to use their dollar to support good, high quality food. It does have a huge impact. It really does.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our two wonderful presenters, Tim Wagner and Stephen Keleti. Fantastic presentations and such an interesting topic that clearly has connections to all of our work and our daily life. So thank you all for joining us on this webinar. We will circulate Tim and Stephen's presentations to you via email, and we'll be sure to follow up about where you can access the recording of this webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.